Welcome back to today's class. Today we're going to discuss what's generally called prehistory. And prehistory is defined as before recorded history. In other words, before written history. So once we move into the ancient Egyptians in the next module, we'll start to have recorded history. At the end of our discussion today, we'll talk about the Sumerian development of a writing system. And we've talked earlier in the course of what the humanities encompass, and one definition is it's a study of what people thought about in the past, what they thought about themselves and others and cared to leave behind. And again, we're going to see this in the arts, architecture, philosophy, religion, literature, and later on in history, we'll see much of it in music. So let's start at the beginning with the so-called Stone Age. This probably brings up images of the old Fred Flintstone's cartoons and things like that. The so-called, quote, cavemen, people who lived in caves. It's called Stone Age because this time period was characterized by tools and weapons made of stone. And it's also called the Paleolithic period. It started around 25 to 30,000 years before the Common Era. There's a short article in the module that explains historical dating. When I went to school, the year 0 was supposed to be the year Jesus Christ was born, and before that was called BC, before Christ. After that, AD, which in Latin means after God. And then, because that is centered on a Christian belief, several decades ago, the nomenclature was changed. And so now BCE is the same thing as BC, and it's before the Common Era. And CE, Common Era, is after the year 0. Or CE is the same as AD. Of course, the new system of BCE and CE still uses a reference point of 0 related to a Christian figure of Jesus Christ. So let's look briefly at the Paleolithic period. We won't spend too much time on this. This is the first time we know that people had some sort of ritual burying of the dead. We know this because we can look into their tombs and we can see that they were buried in certain positions, often in a fetal position, and buried with items of significance. Many times for women, this was a comb, bits of food. For men, it might be a hunting knife or something like that. So there was some sort of ritual. There's a lot of guesswork here as to what it signified because, again, in this prehistory age, there's no writing to accompany it. We also will see in a few minutes there are paintings on cave walls and figurines. Figurines are small small figures a couple inches high. Hunting was the main source of food, and they were referred to as hunter-gatherers. They would also gather wild nuts, wild berries, and whatnot. And as I mentioned before, it's called the Stone Age largely because their tools and weapons were made of stone. Now today, you can see this in any supermarket or store you go into, what they call a paleo diet or Paleolithic diet. It's also called the caveman diet or Stone Age diet. If you have a moment, you may want to Google paleo diet and you'll literally see hundreds of thousands of entries purporting to the wonderful health benefits of this clearly non-modern diet. And we're not really sure what people ate in the Paleolithic age, but we know they obviously didn't have processed foods like we had now. So these are the foods and the diet that we supposedly were eating then. And the best people can determine is about 55% of people's diet came from lean meat. The meat was much leaner or less fat than now because the animals had to walk more. So the animals had much more muscle and less fat. And of course, meat now has much more fat. In fact, if you go into the grocery store and you look at steaks, the most expensive steaks per pound are U.S. Department of Agriculture or USDA prime, and they categorize them by the percentage of fat, and that fat is called marbling. And you look at an expensive steak in terms of how much it costs per pound, and you'll see it has much more fat in it than a less expensive cut of meat. And of course, what happens when that meat is cooked, the fat melts and you have juicier and more tender meat, which most people think tastes much better. And of course, it's not as healthy for people because it has much more saturated fat. And I understand the most expensive meat, and connoisseurs say the best beef comes from Japan, the so-called Kobe beef, where the cows literally never move in their lifetime. They're sort of in a cage. They're fed very high-fat diet, and they're even given massages. And it's that fat content that makes the meat tender. The remaining 45% of the diet, roughly half the diet, were fruits, vegetables, and nuts. These were not cultivated. They did not have settled agriculture, but again, this is what people would gather. There's no known dairy products, and wild grains were only eaten in the case of famine. And there's no added salt or sugar. The salt that was needed would come from the meat that people ate. This is a picture I pulled up off the internet of what you can find something like this in your grocery store. Paleo, and you see next to the paleo that's supposed to be a prehistoric man, I guess, with a bow and arrow. And literally you can, in HEB or Kroger, you can find dozens and dozens of products that are either manufactured by this company or other companies, and they say paleo diet. Now, a figurine is, as the name suggests, a small figure, usually of a human being. This is one found in modern-day Austria. It's about 4 or 5 inches tall. No one knows what it really represents because we have no written record. The assumption is that it's something related to fertility and childbearing, because you can see the exaggerated female parts, the breasts and the abdomen. Now the question is, why would the people have taken the time and the effort to make this figurine? Were they concerned about the survival of their group? They didn't have enough children. Obviously, there was a high rate of infant mortality. Perhaps in warfare, they'd lost a lot of children, or to disease, or to wild animals. Are they concerned about the group? Or is this figurine somehow supposed to represent the fertility of the earth and a sufficient food supply? Even though they didn't have settled agriculture, obviously they depended on fertility to provide the plants for the animals to eat, and also where they would go out and gather wild vegetables and fruits and nuts. Now, art in caves has been found throughout the world from the Stone Age or Paleolithic period. And of course, the reason it's found in caves is many times people live there. Also, the walls of the caves are protected from rain and the sun, which would destroy such paintings on the walls. This is a very famous one in the south of France, and you can very clearly see the various animals that were depicted on the walls. This cave is no longer open to the public because they found when people were going in there, many thousands of tourists a year, that was adversely impacting the paintings because as people breathed, increased the humidity in the cave, and that led to fungus on the paintings. So what they did is they found a nearby cave that had no paintings, and they invited some artists in to make a reproduction. And I've seen it. It looks just like this, of the original cave. So you can only get into the original cave with special permission if you're an archaeologist. Well, for those of us who live here in Texas, we don't need to travel all the way to France to see Paleolithic cave art. We can go to West Texas. So this is a map clearly of Texas. It's a big state, and you can see Houston on the right there, and way off in the east is Waco tanks. For those of you who speak Spanish, you know Waco means a tank or a hole, and it's about a half hour or an hour drive away from El Paso. 4 or 5 years ago, I was in El Paso on business, and I had a free afternoon, so I looked on the internet to see what there was to do in the vicinity, and the most highly recommended attraction was Waco tanks, and I had a rental car, so I drove out there into what was the outcropping in the middle of the desert. So this is a view of Waco tanks. Now you may wonder why there's prehistoric art there. Well, this is a natural rock formation, and again the word Waco in Spanish means hole or depression, and in this it's a huge jumble of rocks, outcropping of rocks. There are large basins, and it does rain in the desert, and so when it rained, these basins and holes would fill up with water, and the water would stay there for quite a long time. So naturally, in prehistoric times, both people and animals would go there as a source of water. So this is a state park. It's not very often visited. So I went to the very, very small visitor center, and there's a large sign there talking about, the number of snakes that come out. And, the last sentence here is the use of flashlights after dark is encouraged to detect the snakes in advance. And above this sign, they had the skins of rattlesnakes, some that were 6 or 7 feet large. And we had to go with a park ranger, and there were 3 or 4 of us who showed up at the same time. So we had to walk down a small trail about a quarter of a mile to get to the actual rocks. And as we walked about 50 feet from us, I took this photo. Here are the snakes. These are rattlesnakes, as you can clearly see from their rattles. And I'm using my zoom on my camera. They weren't that close to me. I got on the other side of the guide to make sure my guide was between me and the snakes. And the guide said not to worry. They were just, as reptiles, they were sunning themselves in the sun. Well, we were all a little nervous after seeing this. So to get to the prehistoric cave drawings, you have to get on your back and push yourself in with your feet, and then it opens up into a fairly large opening. And we were given special flashlights that wouldn't damage the drawings. Now, the park ranger told us that we would not be able to go in if it were not a sunny day, because the snakes had come out, being reptiles, to bathe in the sun, sunbathe, so to speak, and on a rainy day there could be snakes in there. So there were 5 or 6 of us. He asked for 2 volunteers to get on their back and go headfirst into this clay cave. Needless to say, I was not one of the first volunteers. So I watched this brave couple go in. and they came out alive, so I decided I would go in. As you can tell, I don't like snakes, even though I, of course, realize they play an important part in our ecosystem. So you get in, you can see this drawing in red of clearly an animal. And the sun never hits these rocks, nor the rain, so they are preserved. And here's another drawing. Elsewhere in the rock formations, you can see more modern drawings that were made by indigenous tribes or Indian tribes several hundred years ago. And those were much better preserved, but these are the prehistoric ones. Now we'll move on to the Neolithic period. This started around 15,000 or 12,000 years ago and goes up to around 2000 BCE. And this started at the end of the last major ice age. So with the end of the ice age, the ice sheets retreat and people can move out and live in more places. It's often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. If we ask ourselves what a revolution is, it's a major change. You can often see an advertisement for a new product these days, and they say it's a revolutionary development in telecommunications or in phones or whatever. So revolution is something that is a major, major change. In history, we look at the history of the world, what are the revolutions? Well, the Neolithic revolution, because this is the beginning of agriculture. You have, of course, the Industrial Revolution, using machines to help people make things. You have the Communication Revolution, which started with the telegraph in the 1800s, the first time in history when information could be transmitted faster than a person could ride a horse or sail a ship. And many people would say we're now living in the computer revolution, which when you look at world history, it's just incredible how much the computer has changed the world. And it'd be interesting 200 or 300 years from now, if we had a time machine to go forward, to see how people would view the time we're living in. With our 200 years from now, they would consider them rather primitive computers. So the Neolithic Revolution, we have the end of hunter-gathering. You still have people go out and hunt, but we start to have agriculture. People settle down, they clear fields, they grow crops, they harvest them. That means you have to be there for a certain amount of time. You have animals domesticated, and you have settled communities. And this leads, then we'll see in a few minutes, to what is referred to as the beginning of civilization. Now tools are no longer just stone. The main material is bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and this is used for tools as well as weapons. Now, one very famous Neolithic site is Stonehenge in England, in southern England. Some of you may have been there. This is obviously an aerial view. And as you can see, some of the stones have fallen over, but it's a circle of stones, quite large stones, about 25, 30 feet high. And they are arranged in such a way that at certain periods of the year, for instance, June 21st, when the sun in the northern hemisphere is at its highest point, the longest days, you can see the sun through those arches in the middle, and likewise December 31st, you can see the sun another way. This is a photo students always ask me in classes, oh, is that your wife or someone? I say, I have no idea who this is. I pulled this photo up off the internet because rather than telling you that these large stones are 21 feet high, I think it's easier for the average person just to look at there's an adult woman, and you can see that in relation to the adult, just how massive they are. Now, a question archaeologists have is, how did the stone get on the top? They clearly didn't have cranes then. The theory, and again it's a theory, is they built a ramp of dirt, put the stone on the top, and then removed the stone. But we really don't know how the stone got on the top. But you can look at that stone on the top. It weighs as much as several cars. Why was this built? Well, because of the alignment of the stones. Most scientists think that it was a solar calendar and an observatory used to track the movements of the sun and the moon. Now remember, in this period, people have settled. Most people have settled. They have agriculture. And when you have agriculture, you need to know when to plant your crops and when to harvest them. And so it's very, very important to determine the seasons, the dates. And this was done partly by the movement of the sun, knowing in the northern hemisphere the sun is always at its highest point and the day is the longest on June 21st. So that helps you. But you have to know, and today farmers need to know exactly the date. Of course, it's easy today to find out the date in terms of when to plant their crops. Now, we've just been looking at Stonehenge, and it's in Nebraska here in the United States. Some rather eccentric person built a tourist attraction called CarHenge, C-A-R, like an automobile, and it's made of classic American cars, all painted a dull gray color to resemble rocks. And as you can see, they're placed around in a circle, and some cars were put on top of others using cranes. Well, we Texans are never to be outdone, so in North Texas, near Amarillo, someone has designed what's called Cadillac Ranch. These are old 1950s Cadillacs painted in bright colors. They're actually in a straight line. They're not in a circle as Stonehenge, but this is someone's interpretation of North Texas version of Stonehenge. Now the question is civilization. We all use the word civilization. I don't know about you, but when I was 4 or 5 years old, my mother would often tell me to watch my table manners, not talk with my mouth full, etc., because I had to be civilized. Civilization, what is the opposite of civilization? We'll see this later in the course. Many ancient cultures called the people savages or barbarians. But we all know what we mean by civilization. Some people may think it means culture, to have certain manners. But the word actually comes from the Greek word city. The word civ in ancient Greek means city. So a citizen means someone from the city. Okay? And from the same root word we get civil. And when you say someone's civil, it means they're polite. And for the ancient people, that was, well, like someone living in the city. In other words, not like the farmers who were not considered polite, but rather rough. I think, some people today might say, oh, so-and-so is a country bumpkin. They don't live in the suburbs like we do and have good manners. There's always been this sort of tension between city dwellers and farming community. So now we're having urban buildings, permanent buildings that are designed to last a number of years. You have, as people get together, you have to have a way of governing each other. So you have a system of government that's set up. And in every society that's been studied, you start having social classes, which are always based on the amount of wealth people have and the type of work they do. ancient society values certain work more than others, and those with wealth have more prestige and power. Now people begin to be more specialized. You no longer have the family that's out living in a cave, just doing hunting and gathering, maybe living with one or two other families. People start being specialized. They have tools now, so you have someone who specializes in making um, shoes, someone else who specializes in baking bread, etc., etc. And this results obviously in trade and very, very early manufacturing. Not big factories, but you have people trying to produce on scale. And most important, and we'll talk about this a little later in this class, is the development of written communication. People start to write, to record things, either to record the purchase or sale of an object, or to transmit information, or to leave something for future generations. And also in all these societies, we see there's a shared religion. Each individual doesn't have their own religion. And the priests or the ministers, whatever you want to call them, we often say in archaeology, the priests start playing a major role in the community because people look up to them, and because the priests claim to have special ability to ask for favors from the gods, and it's usually plural, the gods, or to intercede in their behalf. We often find too in civilization, depending on geographically where the small town or city is, there's often a need for large-scale irrigation to either control flooding from a river, which for instance we'll see was the basis of the Egyptian civilization along the Nile, or to dig a canal to bring water from a river, fresh water from a river to the city. Well, to do this requires some sort of social organization and political organization to often force people to do this type of work for the good of the community. And now, as I mentioned, with writing, it makes it much easier because we can start having in Mesopotamia the ability to go back and see what people thought and felt at the time. Now, it's generally believed that civilization began in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is in the Middle East, largely present-day Iraq, and this is between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it was called the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent, why? Crescent-shaped, and the soil was very, very fertile. This is the map. You can see Mesopotamia in the upper right-hand side of the map. And again, it's the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And you can see we'll be looking in a minute at Sumer, which is right there next to Babylon and Uruk. And to the left or to the west, we have Egypt, the famous Nile River, which we'll be looking at later. And then in the upper left-hand part of this slide, you'll see Greece, and that will be where we'll be studying ancient Greece right after we finish Egypt. But let's look a little more at Mesopotamia. Now, ancient Mesopotamia had two major periods. One was the Sumerian period from 3500 to about 2350 BCE, and then followed by the Semitic period, 2350 to 612 BCE. By the way, in terms of exams and quizzes, I am not going to ask you these dates, but you should know this generally. You know, it was the Sumerians and the Semitic. Now, Semitic is a word you'll hear often used today. It comes from the name of one of Noah's sons, Shem, and Semitic meant a group of people speaking a Semitic language, a language from this area, which included the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, and others. But today, in common talk, it refers to the Jewish people because the Hebrew language is in the same language group as the Babylonians and Assyrians and Phoenicians. So the Jewish people are commonly identified as Semites or Semitic. So you'll hear someone making an accusation that a certain group of people is anti-Semitic. By that, what it means is anti-Jewish. So we're going to focus on summer, and you recall that's one of the areas in Mesopotamia. And what is of great importance in world history is around the year 3000 BCE, or about 5,000 years ago, 5 civilizations around the world independently developed writing systems. There's no known communication among these civilizations. The first one is the Sumerian, which we'll be talking about here for just a few minutes. The second one were the ancient Egyptians with the hieroglyphics. The third one was in the Indus River Valley in India. The fourth is in modern-day China. And the fifth were the Mayans in Mesoamerica, which is southern Mexico and part of Central America. So independently, with no known contact among these groups, they came up with writing systems. Now going back to Mesopotamia, both the Tigris and Euphrates River would often flood during the rainy season. And so the people who lived there came together in political organizations to build dikes to prevent the flooding of where they lived and their fields. And also they built canals to channel water away so they could have fields distant from the rivers. Now this, as I mentioned before, led to political organization and towns. And we will see very shortly the same thing in ancient Egypt with the annual floods of the Nile River. In the summer, the king was not considered divine. He was not a god. Now, the Egyptian pharaoh was divine and was considered a god. But the king, the Sumerian king, claimed he was God, the god's representative on earth, and that he had a special relationship, therefore, with the gods. And we'll see exactly this same relationship later in Western Europe when the kings and queens of France and England and other countries claimed that they had been selected by God. They weren't divine. Now, in ancient Sumeria, life after death was considered just like eternal gloom. It was something you'd look forward to. There was no concept of heaven and hell, which is so familiar to many people's religions and cultures today. The ancient Egyptians did have a concept of heaven, but the Sumerians, they just thought when life ended, it was eternal gloom and doom. So with that attitude, what sort of philosophy do you have for life? Live it up, make the most of it, and have as good a time as possible on earth. This is a photograph of major ruins in Uruk called the White Temple. And you can see in the lower right, archaeologists' reconstruction of what it looked like. The temple was built at an elevation of 50 or 60 feet because of the mound there. And it was believed that the gods, therefore, would descend and come down to the temple. The earliest form of writing in Sumer was known as cuneiform, which is Latin for the wedge-shaped reed or plant they used to write. They would write by pressing into soft clay tablets, and then they would bake the tablets, which would make them hard, obviously. And they were easy to store, and they were portable. They could carry them around. At first, they used simplified pictures or pictographs, and then that evolved into using wedge shapes marks for the different words. This is the earliest form of Sumerian writing. This is a soft clay tablet. The writer pressed into it with the edge of a plant, and then they baked it to make it hard. This is actually a list of slaves' names. You can see in the upper left of this photo the hand. That meant the slave owner, and the other pictographs designate the names of the slaves. Unfortunately, we will see that slavery existed in virtually every society. It's not something that was invented in recent centuries. And this was not just whites enslaving blacks, which we think of in the United States, obviously, because that's what happened here. You had people enslaving their enemies, and you had many people involved in the slave trade going back this far. So this is wedge-shaped writing. Here you don't have pictographs. Those pictographs evolved into different shapes, and specialists can read this. This is this tablet, which is in the French Museum, the Louvre in Paris. This is related to taxes that were imposed by the government. And finally, just for a minute, I'd like to mention the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is really the first masterpiece of poetic expression. Gilgamesh was the most famous and powerful of Sumerian kings, and this is a long story of his life. It's written on 12 tablets. The textbook has several excerpts which you should read just to get the idea of what it's about. And the theme of this epic is not to be distracted by something you can't obtain. Focus on reality. And this fits in with the religious beliefs. There's no such thing as a heaven with a pleasant life. When you die, in fact, it's all doom and gloom. So live your life to the fullest. Now, the ancient Romans would call this in Latin carpe diem, which means seize the day. And in fact, you can go out and buy t-shirts that say carpe diem, and that's what it means. Seize the day, live every day to the fullest while you have it, because you may not be here tomorrow. Well, thank you. And in the next module, we'll move on to ancient Egypt.